Welcome everybody to this year's Last Best Hope program. Before I introduce our panelists, I want to first note for everybody here the fact that GNAT, Greater North Shire Cable Access, is filming so that this can be shown to a wider audience. GNAT makes this kind of effort for the community so often that it might be possible to take it for granted. We should never do that. They are a nonprofit working hard to make ends meet, and we should always thank them for their effort, and we should remember to support them financially. GNAT does a great job for this area. We have a few members of the audience I want to introduce. One is Representative Brian Keefe, who I saw come in. Kathleen James, one of the people running for one of the seats in this district. And Lawrence Zupan is here, who's running for the U.S. Senate. I think that's it. We appreciate all of you making the effort to be here. This program will run, we'll try to do it in an hour. There'll be a little time at the end for questions. Then we have to whisk Brian and Sue and their spouses out of here for a 7:15 dinner reservation. So at 7 we're gone. They've had a long day that included speaking with students at Burr & Burton. What we know today as the State of the Union address delivered in January used to be called the annual message to Congress, and it was delivered in December. It was typically a dry, nuts and bolts speech about the specifics of the machinery of government. It did not get national attention. It was kind of an in-house assessment. It was really, frankly, a real snooze to listen to. It went on and on and on every year. In December of 1862, remember we're in the middle of the Civil War, President Lincoln delivered his second annual address to Congress. It was, as was the case that these were supposed to be, loaded with detail. There was mention of a treaty with the Sultan of Turkey, the Treasury's income and expenditures of dollars with excruciating exactitude that went on and on and on. He talked about the improvement of the financial condition of the post office. It went down to such detail as the fact that sale of public lands generated $137,476.54. You get the idea. But after 9 pages, and by that I mean the 9 pages I printed off from the internet, very tightly spaced, on and on and on and on and on. Near the end, Lincoln breaks with tradition and closes with the rhetorical flourish we see so often in his great speeches. Fellow citizens, we cannot escape history. The fiery trial through which we pass will light us down in honor or dishonor to the latest generation. We shall nobly save or meanly lose the last best hope on earth. Lincoln is beginning to shift the meaning of the war from simply saving the Union to the even larger task of saving democracy for the entire world. He's enlarging the meaning of the war. And it is from this that our humble series, Last Best Hope, is born. As a Lincoln site, we view it as our obligation to our part to pick up the values that informed Abraham Lincoln's life, integrity, perseverance, and civic responsibility, and carry them forward to future generations. Democracy isn't always easy. In fact, it's not intended to be easy. It requires sacrifice, sometimes real sacrifice, and it requires people to risk a lot personally to carry forth those ideals. That is the genesis of tonight's program. We have with us 2 people who put themselves on the line, made that sacrifice, and were not rewarded with victory. As we thought about it, and we thought about this night in the program, we thought that this could be particularly meaningful because the reality is that democracy requires those who try and don't win just as much as it requires those who do. They are equally important and they should be equally honored, especially when they have played their role honorably. That leads me to my introduction of tonight's presenters, Sue Minter and Brian Dubie. Sue Minter was the 2016 Democratic nominee for governor of Vermont. She obtained her bachelor's degree from Harvard and a master's in city planning from MIT. She has worked over 30 years in the private, public, and nonprofit sector as a professional planner and policymaker. She was elected to the Vermont House of Representatives in 2004 and continued there until 2010. While in the legislature, she was selected to be an Aspen Institute Rodel Fellow in Public Leadership. My understanding is following you in the same position, and was designated as an emerging political leader by the State Legislative Leadership Foundation. She left the legislature when she was appointed Deputy Secretary of Transportation by the incoming Chumlin administration. Following the Irene flooding, she was appointed to oversee the recovery effort. By 2015, she was Secretary of Transportation for the state of Vermont, a position she resigned to run for governor. Most recently, she was the president of the Vermont Special Olympics. She and her husband, David Goodwin, live in Waterbury Center. They have 2 children. Brian Dubie was the Republican candidate for governor of Vermont in 2010. He has a Bachelor of Science in Mechanical Engineering from the University of Vermont. He's been a pilot for American Airlines, both cargo and passenger, since 1989. He was a member of the Vermont Air National Guard from 1982 to 1998 and a member of the United States Air Force Reserve from 1998 to 2012. He has served and continues to serve on so many boards and commissions, as I looked at his bio, that I didn't know where to start. Just trust me, he's a busy person. Brian came out of nowhere to be elected Lieutenant Governor of Vermont in 2002. He went on to serve 4 terms, the entirety of the Douglas administration, until he then ran for governor in 2010. He was a close confidant of Governor Douglas, led international trade missions on his behalf, served as chair of the Governor's Homeland Security Advisory Committee, and assembled public and private sector experts to ensure the state was prepared for natural and man-made disasters. That's just a smattering. Brian and his wife Penny live in Waterbury Center. They have 4 children. So, I want to start with having each of you talk just a little bit about yourselves and what drew you into public service. How did it start? Whichever one of you wants to go first. I don't know whether I should say who or what. Okay. Me? Okay, Ryan's going first. Okay.
Well, first of all, thank you for this great event, and it's so much work to pull something like this off. We've been treated very, very, Penny and I know Dave, I'm speaking for Sue, you have treated us great. It was a real privilege to be at Burton today. It's always fun to spend time with young people. I do want to expand just a little bit before I talk.
Go ahead.
When I researched last best hope, that sounds a little presumptuous. In 1862, following the American Revolution, the French tried it with their revolution, and it ended with a dictator and murder in the streets. And the monarchs in Europe said that America was being propped up the democracy of America was only being successful because of slavery. That's another reason why our president at the time said, we're going to do this. And he made a very politically difficult decision. But that's the context for this phrase, last best hope. On a much smaller scale, I lived in my hometown in Essex Junction. Penny and I were lucky enough to have 4 children. They were in the public school. There was a 5-member board. There was 3 open seats. There was a person running for the school board to, quote, show the teachers who's boss. And my wife, being a teacher, said, "You're running for the school board." And I said, "I'm not running." And I was a commander flying F-16s in the Guard. I was flying for American Airlines, and I was busy then. And I was a dad. And I called 6 of my friends, and they said, "I'm not running." So I ran. And the first year I was on a school board, they met over 100 times. And it was difficult. And the second year I was on the board, they elected me as the chair, and we met 17 times. And why that was important was we were able to get a more diverse, we're going to talk about one theme today, is diversity of thought makes better decisions, and we were able to recruit a more diverse board that said, hey, I can step up for 17 times, and that was one of the outcomes. The third year I was on the board, we were facing Act 60. And our community took the largest increase of any school district in a state under Act 60. And we made a plan, and we didn't do it in the back room. We opened the whole process up. We created a budget review committee. We had bankers and small business people and moms and dads and teachers. And we created something called Super Saturday. And we had one of our 5 schools. We said, all right, we're going to start at 8 o'clock, and every principal is going to present their budget in great detail. And our budget review committee, which was very intimidating, is going to have the opportunity to scrub, and there was plenty of time for edits, so there was no, I'm sorry, it's not, it was all dynamic. And long story short, we passed the budget, and more importantly, we built a community that underscored the importance of education. And that's kind of what got me started on this crazy thing called public service. It was difficult. I say it defied the laws of physics because you put more energy in, you put energy in, you got more energy out. It was something that I never worked harder from school board to lieutenant governor, but it was very satisfying and it was really important work. And that's a short intro for.
How you got started?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Sue?
So I think that I left high school really wanting to make a difference, and early in my 20s I had a terrific experience to work as a legislative aide in the state of Massachusetts. That was my introduction, I think, to state policy making, but even more importantly to how an individual can make a difference. In my tiny town of Jamaica Plain and in the entire city of Boston, we had no recycling at that time. This is in the late 80s. So we decided to initiate a recycling center. Well, we were so successful, we were inundated, and every other community in the city wanted to do the same thing. And by the end of a year and a half of working across the city, we not only had recycling centers everywhere in the city, we had passed a mandatory recycling ordinance. So I think I learned then the importance of being involved and the ways in which an individual can make change. I went to graduate school in public policy making. I ended up in Vermont with what was supposed to be a one-year fellowship, which had also covered my expenses in graduate school. And I ended up pregnant and with child, and realized very quickly that this was the place I wanted to raise my family, and can't imagine a better place. And but also really wanted to be involved in my local community of Waterbury, and served on a number of local boards, Early Childhood Resource Center, and then our local planning commission. For about 6 years, very involved in a process not unlike Brian's of bringing the entire community together in a creative atmosphere around developing our new town plan and really visioning our future and getting a lot of engagement and buy-in. And along the way, we had a very controversial development proposal that I did not support and summarily was dismissed from the Planning Commission by the Select Board. But about a week later, my neighbor announced she wasn't running for state rep. And a little voice inside my head said, maybe you should give it a try. And I have to acknowledge my spouse, David Goodman, who encouraged me wholeheartedly to do this. So we threw our hat into the ring and had the most amazing experience of getting to know my community, going door to door every night and all weekends, and happily winning that election. And I served 6 years, and I just hope we get to talk about how amazingly accessible our legislature is, especially relative to other states and the people we probably met in our various roles. I also say it was probably the hardest work I did, the work that I got the least amount of sleep, but I never woke up more excited and energized for my day. And it's an extraordinary place and experience, and yes, frustrating, but also dynamic. I was then appointed to serve in the executive branch as the Deputy and Transportation Secretary, and also, following Irene, the extraordinary ability to work all around the state, including right here, to help in our recovery. So a lot of threads got me involved, and of course it was an extraordinary experience to run for governor, win or lose.
Come back to that one. So in a way, you've touched on some of this, Sue, but the legislature, when you're there during the winter for all that time, takes on the feel of a large family. Relatively speaking, everybody knows everybody. You spend a lot of time together. You both spent a lot of time at the State House working side by side, not just with people with whom you tended to agree, but also with people with whom you pretty consistently disagreed. And I guess the question is, how did you navigate those waters? Did you just write off some of your opponents, or did you work harder to get to your opponents? Or how did you handle that, and how did you make the legislative process for you feel like a success?
Well, I just think that's a great question, because people really have a perception that we are in a big battle. And I will admit to having, when I was elected, entered the building thinking that there were these two teams and that I was on one team and not on the other. And I learned very quickly that it really is not about those two teams, those two parties. It is actually about how we come together. And for me, I learned it wasn't about my point of view. It was about how I could work with others to come to a common point of view for the vast majority of the work that we do. There was a review done during my tenure under Speaker Gay Symington that showed that 84% of the bills that passed actually came out of committee with unanimous opinion, and every committee is bipartisan. As was seated in the legislature next to a gentleman who was much older than I and a totally different point of view from the Northeast Kingdom. And I learned so much about him and me by getting to understand his perspective. I think what I learned is you must respect and have empathy for others, and I believe that that kind of civil discourse and learning is fundamental to our democracy. I believe it still is pervasive in Vermont. I do not believe it is what carries us forward in Congress. It worries me greatly. I also had the incredible and surprising for me, I worked as a Democrat. My chair of my committee was a Republican. And I learned I had so much more in common with him in some cases than even some of my Democratic colleagues. So it really is, in my view anyway, about how we come together. And that really requires caring about one another, and the legislature really is almost a family. We debate, we disagree, but when we walk outside the door, we care vastly about one another. At least that was my experience.
Yeah, I share many of those observations and similar experiences in the legislature. I'd like to just go back a little bit. When I was a young person, I grew up, I spent a lot of time with my father, my grandfather. If you ever had a McKenzie hot dog, that was my grandfather, John McKenzie. And when he used to talk about being on the Burlington Water Resources Board, and how when you did the normal work of a board, you would inflict small cuts, little cuts, little cuts. And he said we would always go for a coffee after the meetings to kind of nurture and put a little ointment on the cuts. So when I entered into the legislature, I made it a goal that, as a goal, I wanted to be able to, when I left the legislature, say that I had a professional working relationship with everyone that I served with. And that was a stretch goal, but it was an important goal because people in the state of Vermont have elected this person to represent them. So I was under an obligation to say, I'm not going to let petty things get in the way of this important relationship. So I'm proud to say and happy to say that I met that goal when I ended my 8 years in service. One thing that added to my understanding, I'm going to go back to the school board, The second year I was on the school board, when we were in this kind of trying to shrink the amount of meetings, we brought in a Harvard consultant, and his name was Dr. Barry Gentz. And he had a great business background that was helped the school board. We had all the superintendent and his team, 5 principals, and the school board. And he handed out the Myers-Briggs personality analysis, if you're familiar with that. It's a way to do an analysis of the way you're wired. And after lunch, we never talked to the guy, never met him or anything. He said, ooh, this is really, he got the floor and he said, this is really interesting. We got Brian, the chair. He's a pilot, engineer. He makes decisions like eating corn on the cob. Brian reads all his material and he knows exactly the way he's going to vote on the entire meeting. The meeting is kind of a formality. And we've got Marla, who I had some struggles with. Marla shows up to the meeting, and Brian thinks to know, that's 25% of the world thinks to know. Marla represents 75% of the world. 75% of the world talks to know. So when we get to an agenda item, and my fellow board members said we have to talk about it, Barry said Brian doesn't know what she's talking about. So that was all very important. But the most important thing is Barry then went the next step. And he says, Brian, these are strategies that I'm going to give you so that you and Marla can function, that you can, simple little tricks. And the exciting part was it really paid huge dividends on the school board, in the legislature. And I know instinctively, we all know instinctively, although I think I had a pretty good idea of the way I was going to go, I know by talking and by processing, by having this discussion, we always made better decisions as a committee as a result of the sharing and the diversity of our thought. I know that as an airline captain. I have to make sure my co-pilots feel like they're empowered to say, hey, Captain, we're not going to go through that thunderstorm. And I know that as someone who served in public office, and I know that as a leader, the best thing you can do as a leader is foster an environment where people are empowered to say, we're not going to go that way, and to have a conversation, a relationship, and to have a dialogue so that you can make good decisions for the people you serve.
And I think I can hear both of you saying that was possible in the Vermont legislature.
Absolutely.
By any measure, running for governor is a grueling process. It's basically a year of your lives trying to achieve a very specific goal. Why did you decide to put yourselves and your families through the process?
I was motivated. Yeah, I was very committed to the agenda that I had tried to work with Governor Douglas. I was, really committed to. Quite frankly, I was the only candidate, and I felt a real responsibility as a member of the National Guard and as a school board person, as a Vermonter, that I had an obligation. I was in the best position to run. I would say, when you say step in the middle of it, it's a little more complex than that. Because when you run for governor, as Sue mentioned, you bring your spouse. In my case, I brought my wife, my 4 kids, my entire family, and you are in the middle of it. It's a small state. There is a great relationship in the legislature, but Frank Bryant, UVM professor, well respected, said, Brian, campaigns are adversarial. You have an opponent. There are battles. It's a battle of ideas. It should be civil, but it should be robust. And so it was a privilege to run. I have mixed feelings about the sacrifice of running, even in this great state, and traveling around Vermont and this time of year was a real privilege. But as a husband and as a father, it's tough. And but I was, the bottom line, I was very committed to my agenda that I articulated as a part of my campaign.
Okay. Sue?
I think my beginnings were different. Research says that a woman needs to be asked 6 times to run for office before they consider doing it. That was absolutely true for me. I really didn't imagine myself running for governor, but I was asked. I became involved as an advisor and now as a board member with an organization called Emerge Vermont, which is about training women to lead. And as we initiated this organization, which was founded by our one as yet female governor, Madeleine Kunin, she described, if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. And I will tell you that the more I was asked, the more I was willing to think about it. I remember someone saying, well, look at all the other people who are running and think about your credentials relative to them. But the real motivator, I will say, was something that happened when it was a total surprise to me, even though I was the Secretary of Transportation at the time. I was literally running a conference in Delaware, a major national conference, and my phone started to buzz and buzz. My governor had announced that he was not running. So this was a total surprise. I think it was to you too. And I remember that night looking at all of the pundits suggesting who would be running, and there was not a woman among them. Not even considered, not even Deb Markowitz, who had run the last time. And that bugged me. So I do believe that in addition to believing and coming to recognize that I had qualifications for the job, a huge motivator was my belief that we need more women elected, and for women to be elected, they need to run. I, of course, also had an agenda that I developed after a lot of thinking. I did a lot of calling, many people, those who had run before, those who I considered both adversaries in the legislature and friends, and thought deeply about it. And I think part of, what your theme of this evening is, that I had this opportunity to participate in this democracy. And I had my health, and my mom was healthy, and the two kids, neither one was in college, and we were at a moment in our lives that we could do it. And I say we because there's no way I would have done it without the encouragement and daily support of my husband and family, but particularly my husband. So I think that's really why I got involved.
Thank you. So just a little follow-up on that. Talk a little bit on a very personal level, what it's like to be in the maelstrom of a statewide campaign, let's say in October, 3 weeks before the election. What's it, on a very personal level, what's it like? Do you barely see your family? I would guess there's all kinds of things. What's it like?
Well, I mean, a lot of people have difficult jobs. So, running for office, my brother's a sugar maker. He walks 16 miles a day, managing 425 miles of pipeline in a 50,000 tap sugar wood. So I used to say when I was in office, I'm sitting here drinking coffee, listening to your issues, and my brother's out in the woods. So, there's a lot of challenging jobs. And I've had some challenging jobs. Running for office is a privilege. I mean, you get one of the most special things is, especially as an airline pilot, to participate in public service. I mean, you get to meet teachers and go in their classrooms. You get to meet small businesses. You meet farmers. You meet people running sheep operations at Hildene. I mean, or goat dairies. I mean, you get to meet people that are motivated to protect their land from maybe an encroachment of a wind tower. I mean, there are so many people that you get to meet that you get every time you meet someone you're going to learn. So that's all positive. In addition to that, you're responsible for this thing you call the campaign. And in my case, you raise $1 million. It's a small business. You have to have media. You have to have some kind of guidance and control about how you're going to take the money in, because you don't want to take money from everybody. And how are you going to spend the money? And how are you going to maybe defend the reason you're running from a marketplace of ideas that wants to put you in a box that isn't really the essence? So these are kind of things that you're managing. You have volunteers. You want to make sure your volunteers are being ethical and representing your message. So it's a privilege. It's a lot of fun. It's a lot of work. It's very stressful for a lot of reasons, because maybe your motives are pure and your message is pure, but in a marketplace they get impacted, and you don't have control. You do not have control. You can attempt to control who you are and the essence of who you are, and you can't get defensive, because that'll get you off who you really are. But I would, in a single word, I would call it intense. Even in a small state, even in a place. And in my race, I was up, I was down, I was up, I was down. My opponent knew it. Every debate, he would say, "I think you're up," and then the next debate, "I think I'm," So it was, it was an intense, fun, time. Very stressful.
Agreed. Very intense, very stressful, very extraordinary experience about meeting people. Clearly, we are both people who love to meet people and learn from people. But I'll just tell you a day in the life in October. I had a very grueling primary, which I think you were relieved of, but I had to raise $1 million just for the primary, and after that we were broke, so I had to raise another $1 million in 3 months, if you can believe it. And that's the worst part about what running today is about. So it did require tremendous discipline, waking up early. I always made it a point to take a run in the morning and eat well. The rest of the day was a total sprint. Every minute of every day was scheduled. I was told what I did and what I was wearing and where I was going, and I was making phone calls, sadly, to raise money constantly. Sometimes I would have 2 earbuds and 2 phones going at the same time while driving to a debate. That is how crazy it is, sadly, in terms of the money. But the intensity and the stress, constant stress, a lot of media attention, a lot of, I really appreciate Brian talking about his core and believing in your core, because with all that is swirling around you, understanding who you are and what your goals are and your message are is absolutely fundamental to staying in shape and on target and not being off balance. Ours was also very close in the polls until the very end. So it's a lot of really constant preparation, every debate. In the primary, we had almost 30 debates all over the state, fewer in the general election because my opponent really wanted to do very few. But being prepared and in shape and congenial and excited every single day.
Thanks. You answered. That's just what I was kind of looking for. So one of you mentioned this earlier, that running for statewide office is in part a battle. You want to win. You're not running for something new. You're running because you want to win. So anybody running has to be tempted, or at least people around them are trying to tempt you to attack your opponent, maybe more personally. People say they hate negative campaigns, but as we know, the tactic often works. You both ran positive campaigns. Sure, you drew contrasts, and yes, you tried to land a political hit here and there, but you never personalized it. So here's the question. I'm sure you had people around you who were maybe urging you to be more aggressive, a little bit more than you did. How did you draw the lines? What was it that told you how far you were willing to go and how far you were not willing to go?
Well, that's a really tough question. I'm gonna back up, if you allow me. When people ask me what is a campaign like and what is a campaign all about, I thought about that a lot, and I said it's about 6 M's. And the first M is some moral basis that Sue just mentioned. What is in your gut that is driving you to do this crazy thing, like step up for political office? What is at your core? And as you contemplate that and refine that, and you start to write that down, it becomes your message. You communicate what is in your gut in words. and you attract really smart people that help you as an engineer and as a pilot. You attract people that are better with words, and you grow and you learn to express what you're really all about. And as you express this message, people say, sign me up. And that's the third M, manpower, women power. You get people that say, sign me up, I want to help in that. And when they come, they bring money, and that's the fourth M. You need money to run a campaign. You need money to put the next M, which is media. You need to be able to, you can't just write a paper and have it here. If a tree falls in the woods and there's no one there to report it, or you can't put the media behind it to communicate that, it really doesn't happen. The last event that's a successful campaign is going to result in hopefully being successful at the ballot box, and that's the sixth M, and then you have a mandate. You have a mandate to go forward with what you've articulated was all about your campaign. The reason I say that is, as you're pursuing your message and you're trying to achieve your goal, there are times when you're being attacked on something that is not what your message is all about, and you have to draw a contrast. In preparing for this debate, I did read about Abraham Lincoln, and I noticed that he wasn't bashful about making sure that his opponents there was a contrast. He understood that you had to provide a contrast. So there is a fine and a gray line between one is contrast and holding your opponent accountable. You know, some might perceive to be negative campaigning, but if you're really committed to what you've started in this thing called a campaign, you'll try to sort through that. Sue mentioned, as a candidate, you have to really set up some really good controls, because you're out there driving on the road, you're doing debates, you're making phone calls to raise money, and you have to, in our case, we had a weekly meeting of what the theme was for the entire week, and how are we going to, what message are we going to drive this week? And that was all part of a campaign plan that we had put together, months in advance. And then there's these whack-a-mole things that pop up and you have to respond to. But you really want to stay on your message. You want to be positive, and you have to draw a contrast. And it's not easy, but it does. As you have to have a good team and people that really understand who you are and what your brand is and what you're all about. Because there's a lot of delegating, with the campaign and the intensity that Sue talked about. But those are some of my thoughts on it. Thank you.
I feel that my experience is actually very different from Brian's in terms of negative campaign tactics, and that is because our election, the election I ran in, was the first open seat gubernatorial election post Citizens United. And I think it is an entirely different world. And what that means is that there is a whole world of campaigning that goes on the other side of a firewall. Here we had Sue Minter versus Phil Scott, and we had a very positive campaign. Yes, we contrasted with one another, but we did not go after one another in television ads. So I will say, just a quick sidebar, stepping back, as I learned what it would mean to run a statewide campaign in Vermont, I went and met people in DC and met professional campaign consultants. I selected a team, as did everyone else in the race, a media team, someone who would do the polling, and sort of the print media. So there were sort of three elements to that consulting team, and we had these weekly meetings and we developed a plan. But they said right off, you're going to have to go negative. And I said, yeah, that's not what I'm doing. And they said, you will. So along we go. And what happened actually is I didn't have to go negative, because the negative campaign in 2016, and I'm sure in 2018, took place on the other side of this firewall with the super PACs. So After my primary, there was no money in our bank until we raised enough to get on TV. The other thing, I was very naive because I don't tend to watch a lot of TV. I thought Vermonters didn't watch TV. I didn't believe the ads really made a difference. They do. They're absolutely fundamentally important in a statewide race. So very soon, the very first day of the general election, in fact, the super PAC for my opponent had ads on TV for him. And for the next 6 weeks had ads on TV, both defining him in a positive way and then defining me in a negative way. And they were, I think, nasty and insulting ads. They were not, my opponent's ads, they were his super PAC ads. My super PAC, neither he nor I knew anything about the things happening on that other side of the wall. But frankly, I believe the campaign was won on that side of the wall. And I believe it was won significantly through negative attacks. And unfortunately, that is the world and the game that we are in now. I hope it changes. That's my opinion. We'll have to keep an eye. So it's very important to realize when you see ads on TV, who is funding those ads. Some are the candidates and the others are not. And the others, you will never know who is funding them because the rules are different on that side. But there is no coordination. So it really isn't from the candidate or his or her campaign.
So you both had meteoric rises. Brian, straight to lieutenant governor. I don't know how you did that, but straight to lieutenant governor. Sue to the legislature, Irene recovery, then secretary of transportation. Then you both ran for governor. You're in this for all the years you're involved. It's very intense. In some ways, it's what you think about all the time. I've actually been in the legislature, so I know that. I understand how it works. Then you ran for governor and lost. The next morning, you woke up and it was over. How did that feel? And how did you move on, and how long did it take you to move on?
When we start? So I will say that during most of the campaign, I felt like I might win, I might lose. But in the last week, I realized I might win. And I had to absolutely be ready and mentally prepared to be the next governor instantly. And that was something that took me to a new place of believing I was going to win because I actually had to be emotionally prepared. And so by the end, I was winning. My first experience was one of being really proud of what we had accomplished. My team came, once we found out the results and conceded, I spoke first to my family, all of whom were gathered together. And they shared their deep love and admiration for me. And then my campaign team, most of whom were in tears and sobbing, and I said, chin up, look what we did. This is a fantastic experience. And that's what carried me for the first 24 hours. And then there was a crash and a realization that these dreams hadn't come to fruition. And I would say for the next month, I really didn't want to go outside because it's a public humiliation. A lot to be proud of, but a lot to feel like we've failed. I felt that I had failed so many people who had supported me, and I spent the next, actually, 48 hours on the phone calling every single donor and thanking for them. And at some point in that process, I started to weep, and I couldn't make those phone calls anymore. And I sat for about a month in front of our wood stove before I went out to the grocery store. That was the worst place to go. And then, the bruises started to heal, and I started imagining what I could do from here and different ways I could serve, and lots of beautiful things happened from that.
Yeah, I would, some of those same emotions, I certainly share. On election night, my son and I, my family and I were in Montpelier. We're driving home to Essex, and my son was home from college, and him and I are in the front seat, and we got 3 other kids and my wife in the back of her van, and my son said, Dad, you know, we might win. Because we didn't know. It was 11 o'clock at night. It was too close to call. Turned out to be 4,600 votes, and my son said, you know, Dad, we might win, but if we lose, I think we win. And I said, Jack, I think you're right. So I wanted to win. I was in it to win. I was committed and did everything I didn't leave anything on the table. I put it all in. Our family put it all in. But you know, the next day when we figured out that we didn't win at the end of when all the votes were counted, so we just moved on. You know, I certainly grieved, and you know, I'm a fighter pilot. I don't like to lose, but I didn't have any real regrets. And you know, I have a couple jobs. I was still flying for American Airlines. I immediately went to a new school, a new airplane. I served, you know, as you said, on 2 boards. We had 4 undergrads, 3 masters, and 1 PhD. So you know, we had plenty of college expenses. So you know, life moves on, and so you know, I was disappointed. I went through a similar, you know, process of healing. And when Sue talks about making phone calls to donors, when you know, maybe an elderly person, you know, writes you a handwritten note that says, here's my $10, I'm going to give you $10 for a year. You know, when you don't feel like you've, you know, done what she hoped you would achieve, yeah, it's personal. I mean, it's personal. So, yeah, I guess I would share some of those thoughts. But I will say, life is really short, and life is really good. And it was you know, at the end of the day, it was a privilege. It was a privilege to have been, you know, a public servant, and it was an honor to represent my party in the campaign for governor.
Thank you.
So at this point, if anyone would like to ask a question, I will bring you the microphone. Please wait for it so that GNAT can also get this coverage, okay?
I reside in New York State, and as anyone familiar with the New York State legislature knows, we have easily the most corrupt, contentious legislature in the country. So this is really refreshing. What is your view, what are your views on campaign finance reform that eliminate that need to constantly cultivate financial donations and resources, and also have the benefit of sort of leveling the playing field where multimillionaires don't have an intrinsic advantage over just a regular citizen running for office?
Well, thank you for raising that important question. The question really is about how the effects of money are impacting our democracy. I will just mention that your legislature in New York is so different from ours, because ours is a, quote, citizen legislature, which only serves part-time. So we don't have professional staff, we have no staff. And I think there is a lot of difference because of that. And I think Vermonters have a lot to be proud of in terms of the frugality of our legislature. But with respect to campaign contributions, and as I alluded to in my remarks just now, the impact of Citizens United is huge, because it isn't just the need for candidates to cultivate large donors, many of which will come from interests that need to be served by that candidate. I feel very lucky that, you know, it was an enormous amount of money in my mind that we ever had to raise. But relative to other states, it's a drop in the bucket. I did not need to take money. I did not take money from corporations, but from individuals who shared my values. And that was what I was able to do as a first-time candidate. The impact in the national elections and the need for these campaigns to raise this kind of money is simply crippling us, I believe. And they rely more and more on major donors that have a political desire and goal. And when you are needing to raise money, it's very hard to turn that kind of money down. But as terrible as that is, what's happening on the other side is campaigns are being bought by people we don't know who they are. There's no campaign limits, and there's no transparency about who's running these super PACs. And it is a true beginning of a potential demise in our democracy. It is fundamentally problematic. We in Vermont, when I first served in the legislature, had a fantastic campaign finance. You couldn't spend more than $250 on any one candidate. You could never contribute more than that. The max donation for gubernatorial race now. So that was overturned by the Republican Party in a lawsuit before the Supreme Court. We still have campaign limits, but they are higher. The maximum for the gubernatorial race right now is $4,000 per donor. But then there are ways around it, because campaign parties, political parties, can donate more. So donors who might max out to one candidate can then help donate to the party that can help donate. So there are ways around it. I hope someday we get to it. I don't see it on the top part of the agenda now, but it is a fundamental challenge to our democracy, and it worries me greatly.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. I share some of the observations that Sue mentioned. There is some really important constitutional, first of all, let me just say corruption. There's no place for corruption. I hear stories about New York legislature. I don't have any first-hand experience. I do have first-hand experience as your lieutenant governor for 8 years in the state of Vermont. And, you know, I might be naive. There may be some corruption. I didn't see it.
Yeah.
I didn't see it. And if, you know, that's why, you know, the press, you might not like them, but they have a very important role to play. You know, transparency, sunshine, you know, the more our process is open to the public, the less possibility of corruption. So let me just say that. I will say, you know, just the little contrarian of a view is there is a thing called the right to free speech. And so when governments are, or, you know, there's an agenda that says a group or a company or an individual can't have the right to free speech, that's a problem. So now that becomes, that's what Citizen United is all about, the right to free speech. So when you start to say you're going to limit, then you're starting to step on everyone's right in this country to free speech. You know, and the flip side is, I'm a Republican in the state of Vermont, and I don't think I'm not complaining, but generally the press, when we talk about a campaign, the press has a huge role in the way your picture shows up. I've run, I think, 6 statewide campaigns. The way your picture's in the paper, are you smiling? What page are you on? You know, what's the placement? What's the headline? These are all subtle influences. So when the press has a huge influence, and I'm not saying it's left or right, but I'm saying it has a huge influence. A campaign should be able to rise above that, or at least counterbalance that. So you need campaigns to maybe make sure that you're represented. How many times have I been pulled onto issues that aren't really my issue in a debate format that is, you know, really a story created by the press that is not my issue. So I'm sympathetic to what Sue says. Transparency is really important. If you give $1, there should be a website. Everybody should know who's given and what money you're taking, and your motive should be questioned by anybody. You know, you received this amount of money. You know, what's attached to it. So, but it's a difficult thing to have some kind of a prescription or some kind of a solution to it.
So, by the way, as we ask questions, we're not interested in talking about specific issues. We're really interested in talking about this notion of what we can do to make democracy that much more accessible, work that much better, and our role in it. We want to keep it at that level, not go to specific questions about policy issues.
Good evening. First, I'd like to thank Sue for the most beautiful bridge in southern Vermont. But my question is really around diversity and equity in the public square. We have a state rep who dropped out of the race because of openly and blatantly racist Vermonters who want to create a white homeland. And how do you respond to those individuals that don't share the ideas of inclusivity in the state?
Well, I would just say, it's disappointing as a Vermonter. I have a privilege of my work. I work with people I fly with a lot of female co-pilots. I fly with a lot of minority co-pilots. I fly with a lot of flight attendants. I fly, I have a lot of diversity in my working world. And my regret is that maybe the youngsters at Burton Academy that we saw today don't get the opportunity that I have in my professional life as a Vermonter. And that the incident that you described is unacceptable. I'm not familiar with all of the details, but I would say, we live in a very white state, as you mentioned, and we should condemn when we see a lack of tolerance or a lack of acceptance, and as I mentioned in my previous remarks, our diversity is our strength. It's our strength in communities and families. We need to be tolerant. We need to, accept people that think different, look different, act different, make different choices. So I would just say the one thing we can do is we can all agree that is unacceptable. And I'm glad you raised the issue to give us the opportunity to condemn it. And we all, as Sue mentioned, a lot of people made 6 times, she said, to ask. So we need to do the same thing. As a commander in the Air Guard, I've done a lot of recruiting for minorities to become pilots in the Vermont Air Guard, and it's very complex. It's complex because of spouses, or maybe the age group. People want to have a social life, and they say, hey, what is the diversity in Burlington or in Vermont or Southern Vermont? And it isn't just like, hey, we have a great job for you. It's more difficult than that. So a combination of keep asking, making 6 phone calls, condemning it when we see it, and thank you for raising the issue, sir.
Yeah, I would also say thank you for raising this issue. The fact that a member of our legislature has been targeted and whose life and livelihood and family has been threatened because of racial intolerance is an outrage that we all need to actually focus on and address. And thank you for the work you do around the state, bringing diversity and inclusion into the agenda. We do live in this white state, and we do have an obligation to build greater tolerance, to learn about our own intolerance and implicit biases that we carry. And that's not an easy thing, as you know. I hope that we can use Kaya's story as yet another reason to begin and have much greater discourse on racial intolerance and the need for greater inclusion of all thinking. One of the things we talked about with the students today is tolerance of different ideas. We continue to have respect and understanding even as we disagree, but we have to have the space for that disagreement, for views that are different from our own to be observed and listened to. I am deeply disturbed by what has happened to Kaya. I am glad it is being taken up by the Attorney General. I hope we use this investigation as a way to continue to question what is happening. And sadly, I believe the national discussion and tenor right now is giving voice to a lot more intolerance. I believe that at this time it is incumbent upon us now perhaps more than ever to step up in whatever way we have to build community, to understand one another's needs, to listen and learn, and to change that dynamic. That is a very complicated discussion, as you know much more than I, but we have to use this terrible incident as a reason to face this. I had an amazing experience running Special Olympics Vermont, and which is all about a global movement for inclusion for people with intellectual disabilities. And we use sport to change the dynamic. We actually have teams and sports where we have unified people with and without disabilities playing on sports teams together in the high school. We build leadership and tolerance and understanding through that power of sport and teamwork. And I've seen it really change lives and change minds and attitude. It's a creative way to build inclusion. And maybe it's an example of what we can do, different ways to build tolerance and understanding, which we have to do.
I have a two-pronged question that follows up on what Sue just alluded to with the students, and I'm curious to know what, if anything, you both learned from the students today that would move them to get involved, whether it's running for office or working on a campaign or whatever it might be, because being involved, you can be involved, as we know, in many different ways. And the second part of my question is, Seth, what will Hildene be doing to continue the effort to get our young students who are about to earn the right to vote or garner the right to vote to become involved? And obviously, this is not going to be a one-time effort.
So the story that I shared with the students at Burton Academy today was a story about my Uncle John. So I came back from flight school. I got a job at Simmons Precision up the road in Virgins, Vermont. And I went and saw my Uncle John, and he was on his deathbed. He was at the Gosbrian Hospital, and he was suffering from diabetes, and he literally never left the hospital. And my Uncle John said, "Hey, Brian, how's your new job going?" And I said, "You know, it's not really going that good, Uncle John." I said, "As a matter of fact, I think I made a wrong choice by choosing this particular job. The place is chaos." My Uncle John sat there and thought for a minute, and then gently but firmly said, "That's where you're supposed to be. You're supposed to step up and create order from the chaos. You don't want to be in a cubicle with everything rigid and orderly. You want to be in a place where you can make a difference." It was really that encouragement that reinforced this idea that my wife had to run for school board, run for lieutenant governor, to be a pilot, to do a lot of things. My Uncle John really encouraged me. So when you think about racial inequality or maybe wealth inequality or some other really important issues, I said to the students, and I'll say to anyone, we all have that obligation and an opportunity to step up regardless of where we live and our circumstances. And to the young people, just because it's chaotic at the national level and there's a lot of stuff going on in the newspapers and all kinds of rancor, that's really an opportunity to make a difference. And that was my words and pass along my advice that I received from my Uncle John.
These are really unbelievable historic times that we are living through, I believe. And I sometimes think these are the worst of times and these are the best of times, because I see people engaging in wanting to change the future in many different ways. The students, I believe, the future is in their hands. And when I meet young people in my various experiences, I have seen a crop of incredible talent. But we have a challenge. And some of the ways I see the main thing is to get them involved in something that connects with them. My son had the opportunity to be a page in the legislature. This completely transformed him and his interest in what was happening around him. Many of the students at Burton and students across the state became very involved in the gun safety debate. And I absolutely believe, and what I told the students is that the students' voice made an enormous difference for legislators. And I know that because they spoke with me, those legislative colleagues. And, this was an issue that really had never been raised, having background checks on guns. And it's a very divisive issue, unfortunately, but has found its way to the forefront. My campaign was really the first time we discussed that as a statewide issue. And I think it made a ripple effect. And the students collaborating, not just in Vermont, but across this country, have stepped up in leadership and are recognizing not just their power and opportunity, but their obligation to be involved. So I think our task is, how do we light that fire of interest and obligation and of sense of responsibility for young people? When I was on the Planning Commission and we were building our future plan, we went to students and gave them cameras, and we said, let's make a video of the key places in this community, and then let's interview students about what's missing. What do they want to live here? So I think it's about going, any event that I've ever had, as long as I can get students there, the parents show up, and all of a sudden participation raises. Our students are hungry. A big challenge that we face in the future relates to media and their access to media. The newspaper is a media of the past. Young people are not looking for their news in the newspaper. They're reading it online. And we have to be educated about what is fake news and what is real news. And we have to figure out how do we get into their way of thinking and learning. And it's different from our generation generally in this room.
So I'll answer my part of the question as best I can. Hildene is organized under our mission of values into action, straight from Lincoln. Our core values are integrity, perseverance, and civic responsibility. And so when we work with young people, we try to instill that notion of civic responsibility and civic engagement is something that permeates all of our programs. We bring to Hildene on buses with their teachers more than 3,000 elementary school children a year. The programs that we have are quietly instilling in them the notion that they have a role to play in the world. As we teach them about ecology, natural science, hands-on history, and the other things that we engage with kids, young kids. For the middle school population, we run a statewide essay competition. It's called the Hildene 8th grade Lincoln Essay Competition. We set it up with a preamble, sort of like I did tonight, a little bit about Lincoln and having them understand the role that Lincoln played in actually changing the world. We don't ask them history questions. We ask them, in essence, what role are you going to play in changing the world? How are you going to be engaged? And these are 8th graders, so we're beginning to get them, maybe for the first time, to think about the larger world and something larger than themselves. So that permeates our program, whether it's the high school level, the elementary school level, or the middle school level. It's a great question, and it really is what we're trying to do. Thank you. So I think we have time for, let's say, one more.
Can I see any hands? Thank you for bearing with us with the rain. I know it's hard to hear. I keep turning the levels up and turning them down. Who would like to ask a question or make a comment? Really? Oh, come on, you're Vermonters. No, you have something you want to say.
I have one more I'll do.
All right, go for it,
If nothing else, Stephanie. So we've been kind of touching on this a little bit, and it's fair to say that many people are disillusioned about the political process. You both just touched on this a little bit a minute ago. Not just about the political process, but even the ability of government to be a constructive force in their lives. In the meantime, politics divides us perhaps more than it ever has, although look to the election of 1800, you could dispute that statement, but friendships and neighbors barely speak to each other because of politics. People purposely move to a red state or a blue state. I guess, how how do you feel about that? And really, are you discouraged about the ability of the political process to accomplish positive outcomes and bring us together, or are you encouraged? Are you feeling like maybe it seeds of both, or how are you feeling? How are you feeling about the political process? I guess you can talk about it on both the state level and the national level. You think there's a real difference there? What do I do?
Yeah, so I'll go first. So I mentioned Frank Bryant before, professor at University of Vermont, Poli-Sci. Our system is, he said it really clearly and really strongly. Our system is designed not to work. The federal and the state system has checks and balances. And people need to understand our four founders had a distrust of centralized government. So they set up checks and balances. So when people want to get things done, there has to be consensus. And if there isn't consensus, the system is designed not to work. So, we've talked about consensus and diversity of thought. At the end of the day, there's votes that are cast. But that gives me some context to try to answer your next question. Are you encouraged or discouraged? Well, quite frankly, I'm a little of both. I'm very discouraged on one level about the national conversation. But as a student of history, as we toured Hildene today, Abe Lincoln lost 3 children in childhood. He had his wife that had untreated, undiagnosed mental illness. When I was reading in preparation for this event, he faced duels because of political attacks that he put up an op-ed, and he actually had a duel. He fought a civil war. He was assassinated. So in the context of, we have challenges. Racial inequality is unacceptable anywhere. We need to do a better job of teaching all children, not just the children of Burton Academy. We have real challenges. But I've had the opportunity to travel a lot. I know Sue has also. We live in a very special state. We live in a very special country. We live in a very special time. I am an optimist. And whenever I get discouraged, I start to think about, where I was or what I observed or what our challenges were. And as I reflect and as I see what's happening, I'm an optimist. I was on a tailgate with my grandfather that I've talked about, and we're swinging our legs down on the interval farm where he raised hogs in Burlington on the Ira Allen farm. And I said, Grant, it must have been great back in the good old days. You didn't have to worry about pollution and overpopulation. I rattled off 4 or 5 things that are no longer seem like discussed. And my grandfather sat there and he listened and he said, good old days, huh? And he's swinging his leg because he said, see that leg? He had polio. He said, I lost my best friend in second grade of polio. He said, have you ever heard of the rickets? I said, no, Grandpa, I hadn't. Well, I lost my other friend in the 3rd grade, rickets. And then he proceeded to list 3 or 4 other diseases that I had never even heard about. Do we have some challenges today? Yes, we do. Am I encouraged? I certainly am encouraged. And I think if you look at history and you look at Watts in the 60s in LA, and you look at the riots that we had not very long ago, you can see that we're on a trajectory that I think is encouraging. And we have a lot more to do, but we have a really good, based on a lot of people here, we're standing on your shoulders as we, the younger and the people that we talk today at Burton. We have a great foundation in this country to build a more successful trajectory going forward.
I'm with you. Good. I feel the same. I feel discouraged about many, many things and encouraged. Your question was the role of government in people's lives. I've had this exciting opportunity in my life to work in the legislative branch of government and the executive branch of government. And I was constantly feeling proud of what our government does in this state for us and for our landscape and for our entrepreneurs. There are so many challenges, and the most important of which is that we have too few people to afford what we want to do. But we are frugal. I served, 4 years, and during the Great Recession on the Appropriations Committee. That is where we have to make all kinds of decisions about what we do and don't fund, and our state revenues were plummeting, and I know Brian knows this well. But I was incredibly proud of the decisions we made, the process we used, about listening. We came to near unanimous agreement in a bipartisan committee. That is what we strive for. So that issue of working to listen and work together to mold something is real, and it makes me proud. And I know that it isn't done in many, if not most, other legislatures. I worry if we can sustain it. And as in the executive branch, seeing what we did, and I had the most amazing life experience after Tropical Storm Irene, and probably many of you were affected by this or aware of it, and the experience of seeing how people can come together to take care of one another when in crisis was a life-changing experience for me, and will always make me an optimist, because I know what we're capable of and what we're really made of beyond the discourse that can be so conflictual. So I really do believe in our power of love and of community, and I think in spite of deep challenges, that, when you do think about Lincoln and the Civil War, I mean, to be a president of this country through that war and after, and to be that leader, we need great leaders like that. And I know they're going to come from this next generation. And I think it's great, and I thank you so much for inviting us and hosting us, but to have this kind of discourse, and I hope we continue to have it and to really talk about the role of civic engagement in our democracy. It's so important.
Thank you. So, thank you, Sue and Brian. And I think the point of this program, at least in part, is that you have both done something very worthwhile with your lives and very worthwhile for all the people of the state of Vermont. You are exemplars of democracy in action. You're exemplars in through your careers. You both were exemplars of civility in the process, and I've admired both of you from afar as I watched that going on. And I think, so from all of us at Hildene, and I suspect from everybody in the audience, thank you for giving yourselves today, and thank you for all your efforts to make Vermont a better place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.